The Ice Princess by Camilla Lackberg. Part 1.
The house was desolate and empty. A thin sheet of ice had formed in the bathtub. He thought she looked like a princess lying there. An ice princess. He reached out his hand and touched her. The blood on her wrists had congealed long ago. His love for her had never been stronger. He caressed her arm, as if he were caressing the soul that had now left her body. He didn't look back when he left. It was not goodbye. It was until we meet again.
Eilert Berg was not a happy man. His breathing was strained and his breath came out of his mouth in little white puffs, but his health was not what he considered his biggest problem. For Eilert had a secret. For the first time, he saw an opportunity for a little freedom in the autumn of his years, away from his wife, and he did not intend to squander it. He stopped to catch his breath on the last steep approach to the house. Spain or maybe Greece would thaw the chill that seemed to come from deep inside him. Eilert reckoned that he had at least 10 years left, and he intended to make the most of them. His daily walk in the early morning hours had been his only time spent in peace and quiet. He always took the same route, and people who knew his habits would often come out and have a chat. He particularly enjoyed talking with the pretty girl in the house farthest up the hill by the Hawkerbacken school. She was only there on weekends, always alone, but she was happy to take the time to talk about the weather. She was nice to look at, too. That was something he still appreciated, even though he was old now. About a year ago, she had asked him whether he might consider stopping in at the house on Friday mornings. She would give him a key, so he could just look in and see that everything was in order. The task didn't seem particularly burdensome, and once a month there was an envelope with his name on it waiting in her letterbox, containing what was to him a princely sum. And it was nice to feel useful. The gate hung crookedly and it groaned when he pushed on it. Eilert was just about to put the key in the lock when he saw that the door was ajar. In astonishment, he opened it and stepped into the entryway. "Hello? Is anybody at home?" There was no answer. He saw his own breath coming out of his mouth and realized that the house was freezing cold. All at once he didn't know what to do. There was something seriously wrong, and he didn't think it was just a faulty furnace. He walked through the rooms. Nothing seemed to have been touched. He went upstairs. The staircase was steep, and he had to grab on hard to the banister. The bedroom was just as neat as the rest of the house. The bed was made, and there was a suitcase standing at the foot. Nothing seemed to have been unpacked. Now he felt a bit foolish. Maybe she'd arrived a little early, discovered that the furnace wasn't working, and gone out to find someone to fix it. And yet he really didn't believe that explanation. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his joints, the same way he sometimes felt an approaching storm. He went back downstairs. There, too, everything looked the way it should. The only room remaining was the bathroom. He stood there, hesitating for a moment, realized that he was acting a bit ridiculously, and firmly pushed open the door. Seconds later, he was hurrying to the front door as fast as his age would permit, grabbing hold of the railing to keep him from tumbling headlong down the steps. Out on the pavement, he stopped, at a loss at what to do. A little way down the street, he caught sight of someone approaching at a brisk walk, and recognized Tora's daughter, Erika. He called out to her to stop. Erika Falk shut down her computer and went out to the kitchen to refill her coffee cup. She felt under pressure from all directions. The publishers wanted the first draft of the book in August, and she had hardly begun. The book about Selma Lagerlöf, her 5th biography about a Swedish woman writer, was supposed to be her best, but she was utterly drained of any desire to write. It was more than a month since her parents had died, but her grief was just as fresh today as when she received the news. Cleaning out her parents' house had not gone as quickly as she had hoped either. Everything brought back memories. It took hours to pack every carton, because with each item she was engulfed in images from a life that sometimes felt very close, and sometimes very, very far away. Her flat in Stockholm had been sublet for the time being, and she reckoned she might as well stay here at her parents' home in Fjällbacka and write. The house was a bit out of town in Selvik, and the surroundings were calm and peaceful. Erika sat down on the enclosed veranda and looked out over the islands and skerries. The view never failed to take her breath away. Each new season brought its own spectacular scenery, and today it was bathed in bright sunshine that sent cascades of glittering light over the thick layer of ice on the sea. Her father would have loved a day like this. She felt a catch in her throat, and the air in the house all at once seemed stifling. She decided to go for a walk. Outside it was gloriously quiet. She picked up her pace and turned left towards the hill leading up to the Håkabacken school. As Erika approached the top of the hill, she heard Eilert Berg yelling something she couldn't really make out. He was waving his arms and coming towards her. "She's dead!" Eilert was breathing hard in small, short gasps. "Calm down, Eilert. What happened?" "She's lying in there, dead." Erika hadn't been in this house for a long time, but she had once known it well, and she knew where the bathroom was. She shivered in the cold despite her warm clothing. She didn't really know what she had expected from Eilert's curt statement, but nothing had prepared her for the blood. The bathroom was completely tiled in white, so the effect of the blood in and around the bathtub was even more striking. In spite of the unnatural interplay of white and blue on the body, Erika recognized her at once. It was Alexandra Wigner, née Karlgren, daughter of the family that owned this house. The corpse's eyes were shut, but the lips were bright blue. A thin film of ice had formed around the torso. The right arm hung limply over the edge. The other arm was visible only above the elbow, with the rest hidden beneath the ice. Alex's long blonde hair was spread out like a fan over the end of the tub, but looked brittle and frozen in the cold. Erika stood for a long time looking at her. Then she backed silently out of the room. Afterwards, everything seemed to happen in a blur. She rang the doctor on duty on her mobile phone and waited with Eilert until the doctor and the ambulance arrived. She recognized the signs of shock, and she poured herself a large shot of cognac as soon as she got home. Perhaps not what the doctor would order, but it made her hand stop shaking. The sight of Alex had taken her back to her childhood. It was more than 25 years ago that they had been best friends. And yet, Erika had a hard time reconciling herself to the thought that Alex had taken her own life, which was the inescapable interpretation of what she had seen. The Alexandra she had known was one of the most alive and confident people she could imagine. According to what Erika had heard through the grapevine, life had been kind to Alex, just as Erika had always thought it would be. She ran an art gallery in Göteborg, she was married to a man who was both successful and nice, and she lived in a house as big as a manor on the island of Särö. But something had obviously gone wrong. By morning, the events of the preceding day seemed like a bad dream. She was so tired that her whole body ached. She decided on impulse to visit Alexandra's parents. Losing a parent was hard, but it was still part of the natural order of things. Losing a child must be horrible. Besides, she and Alexandra had once been as close as only best friends can be. The house looked deserted. Alexandra's maternal aunt and uncle lived in Talgerton, a street halfway between the centre of Fjällbacka and Selvik campground. All the houses were perched high up on a slope, and their lawns slanted steeply down towards the road on the side facing the water. The main door was in the back of the house. The doorbell reverberated and then died out. Not a peep was heard from inside, and she was just about to turn and leave when the door slowly opened. "Yes? Hi, I'm Erika Falk. I'm the one who—" She left the rest of her sentence hanging in mid-air. She felt foolish for introducing herself so formally. Alex's aunt, Ulla Persson, knew very well who she was. Ulla went into the kitchen and let Erika find her own way. In the living room, Birgit and Karl-Erik Karlgren sat desperately holding on to each other. Both had wet streaks running down their faces, and Erika felt that she was trespassing in an extremely private space. She sat down cautiously on the sofa facing them, and clasped her hands in her lap. No one had yet uttered a word since she entered the room. How did she look? At first, Erika didn't understand what Birgit had said. Her voice was tiny, like a child's. Erika didn't know what to answer. Lonely was what finally came out, and she regretted it at once. I didn't mean... The sentence faded away and was absorbed by the silence. She didn't kill herself. Birgit's voice all at once sounded strong and determined. Karl-Erik squeezed his wife's hand and nodded in agreement. Birgit repeated, "She didn't kill herself. I know her better than anyone, and I know that she would never be capable of taking her own life. You must realize that. You knew her too." She straightened up a bit more with each syllable, and Erika saw a spark light up in her eyes. "Birgit, I'm not really sure. It was 25 years ago that Alexandra and I were friends. I really don't know a thing about her. Sometimes you just don't know someone as well as you think you do." Even Erika could hear how lame this sounded. Her words seemed to ricochet off the walls. This time Karl-Erik spoke up. "I know it sounds as if we're denying what happened, and perhaps we're not presenting a very coherent impression right now, but even if Alex did take her own life for some reason, she would never have done it in this way. You probably remember that Alex was hysterically afraid of blood. If she got the slightest cut, she was absolutely uncontrollable until someone put a bandage on it. That's why I'm quite sure that she would have chosen some other method, like sleeping pills, for instance. There is no way in hell that Alex could have managed to cut herself, first on one arm and then on the other." His voice was compelling. Even though Erika was still convinced that she was listening to the hope of two people in despair, she couldn't help feeling a flicker of doubt. Birgit gave her husband an urgent look, as if exhorting him to say something. Apparently it was something they had discussed before Erika arrived. "We'd like you to write an article about Alex, for publication in Bohuslänningen, about her life, her dreams, and her death. It would mean a great deal to Birgit and me. Fjällbacka has always been our home, and it always will be, and that was true for Alex too. You can start by talking to her husband Henrik. We spoke with him and he's willing to help. Of course, you'll be compensated for all your expenses." With that, they apparently considered the subject closed. Without actually having accepted the assignment, Erika found herself standing outside on the steps with the telephone number and address of Henrik Wittner in her hand, as the door closed behind her. Monday came with temperatures above freezing and clouds heavy with rain. Henrik had sounded pleasant on the telephone. Of course she could come over and ask him questions about Alexandra, since the memorial article was so important to her parents. The house exceeded all her expectations. An enormous white villa from the turn of the last century, with a view of the water and a small gazebo. Erika drove down an avenue of willow trees and through a tall wrought iron gate onto the gravel courtyard in the front of the house. Stone steps led up to a substantial oak door. She was received by a man she realized at once had to be Henrik Wigner. He helped her off with her coat and showed her the way to the parlour off the hall. She sat down gingerly on the sofa. Even with her limited knowledge of antiques, she could tell the sofa was old and probably very valuable. She said yes to Henrik's offer of coffee. As he pottered about with the coffee, she watched him surreptitiously. He was casually dressed in perfectly pressed chinos and a sky-blue shirt. His hair was dark, almost black, and cut in a style that was elegant but not excessively fastidious. His eyes were dark brown and gave him a slightly Southern European look. Henrik and Alex must have made a strikingly good-looking couple. What an incredibly lovely house. Thank you. My paternal great-grandfather had the house built early in the last century, and it's been in the family ever since. If these walls could talk. He made a sweeping gesture and smiled at Erika. Alex loved this house. Erika had been wondering how to broach the real reason why she was sitting here. She was grateful when Henrik himself brought up the topic of Alex. How long did you live here together? Ever since we were married, 15 years. We met when we were both studying in Paris. She was reading art history, and I was trying to acquire enough knowledge about the business world to run the family empire. Directly after the wedding, we moved back to Sweden, to this house. My parents were both dead, and the house had stood empty for a couple of years while I was abroad, but Alex immediately began to renovate it. She wanted everything to be perfect. What was Alex like as a person? Henrik took his time before answering the question. Beautiful. Calm. A perfectionist to her fingertips. She might have seemed vain to people who didn't know her, but that was because she didn't easily let anyone into her life. You loved her? More than anything else in the world. Alexandra was my whole life. Everything I did, everything I said revolved around her. The ironic thing is that she never even noticed. Birgit and Karl-Erik don't think she took her own life. Yes, I know. They assume that I wouldn't believe she did it either. But, to be honest, I don't quite know what I think. I lived with her for over 15 years, but I never really knew her. It was as though she harboured a secret that she couldn't share with anyone. He went on. Does that sound odd? But because I don't know what that secret was, I can't say whether she was capable of taking her own life. How was her relationship with her parents and her sister? He thought for a long time before he replied. Tense. As if they were all tiptoeing round one another. The only one who ever said what she thought was her little sister Julia, and she's a very strange person. As you probably know, Birgit gave birth to Julia quite late in life. She was already a good bit past 40, and it wasn't planned. So Julia has somehow always been the cuckoo in the nest. And it couldn't have been very easy to have a sister like Alex. But I like her. There's definitely something underneath her surly exterior. I only hope that someday someone will make the effort to find it. Erika felt that the conversation was nearing an end. In the pauses, the silence in the house had been total, and she could sense that in the midst of all this luxury, it had now become a lonely house for Henrik Wigner. She stood up and held out her hand. He took it in both of his, held it for a few seconds, then released it. He walked her to the door. "I think I'll drive down to the gallery and look around a bit," she said. "That's a good idea." Alex was incredibly proud of it. She built the business from the ground up, together with a friend from her student years in Paris, Francine Bijou. "I'll give her a ring and explain who you are. I'm sure she'll be glad to tell you a bit about Alex." The gallery was in Schalmerschgarten, parallel to the main shopping street. Galerie Abstract was on the left, with big display windows facing the street. A bell over the door pinged as she entered. The space was much bigger than it looked from the outside, painted white. At the far end of the gallery she saw a woman who looked unmistakably French. She exuded sheer elegance as she discussed a painting with a customer. "I'll be right there. Please have a look around in the meantime." As the gallery's name indicated, all the paintings were done in the abstract style. Erika was standing before a gigantic red painting with yellow, irregularly divided sections when she heard Francine come up behind her with heels clacking on the checkerboard floor. "You must be Erika. Henri just rang and told me you were on your way here." The woman facing her was small and slender. Her hair was raven black, gathered in a chignon at the nape of her neck. She looked at the painting. "And that's a very sad story. The painter's name is Anders Nilsson. He's actually from here in Fjällbacka. It was Alex who discovered him. He's incredibly talented. Unfortunately, he's also a serious alcoholic. It just burns me up that someone can have so much talent and squander it on drink. He's lucky that Alex discovered his paintings, otherwise the only ones who would have enjoyed them would be the winos of Fjällbacka." Francine saw Erika's expression and added, "I didn't mean to sound so cynical. Let's sit down and talk over a cup of coffee." She led Erika towards a small room behind the gallery. The table was small and had room for only 2 chairs. "From what I understand, Alex's parents asked you to write a commemorative article about her life. I think it's fabulous that you're taking so much trouble on behalf of Alex's parents and Alex." Francine leaned across the table and placed a well-manicured hand over Erika's. "You and Alex met in Paris?" "Yes, we studied art history together. We ran into each other the very first day. She looked lost and I felt lost. The rest is history, as they say." "How long have you known each other?" "Let's see. Henri and Alex celebrated their 15th anniversary last autumn, so it would be 17 years. For 15 of those years we've run this gallery together." She fell silent, and to Erika's astonishment lit a cigarette. For some reason she hadn't pictured Francine as a smoker. She took a deep drag without taking her eyes off Erika. "Didn't you wonder where she was?" Erika asked. "She must have been lying there a week before we found her." It occurred to Erika that she hadn't thought to ask Henrik the same question. "I know it sounds strange, but no, I didn't. Alex—" She hesitated. "Alex always did pretty much as she liked. This wasn't the first time she was gone for a while. She usually popped up later as if nothing had happened." A tear threatened to spill from her eye. Erika looked down to allow Francine to dry her eyes discreetly. "How did Henrik react when Alex simply vanished?" "You've met him?" Alex could do no wrong in his eyes. Henri has spent the past 15 years worshipping her. Poor Henri. Why, poor Henri? Alex didn't love him. Sooner or later he would have been forced to realize that. She stubbed out the first cigarette and lit another. Henrik hinted that in all the years of their marriage it felt as though Alex was hiding something from him. Do you know whether that's true, and if so, what it could be? That was unusually perceptive of him. I may have underestimated Henri. She raised a finely shaped eyebrow. To your first question, I will answer yes. I've always known that she was carrying some sort of baggage. To the second question, I must answer no. I don't have the faintest idea what it could be. Despite our long friendship, there was always a point at which Alex would signal so far and no farther. I accepted it, while Henri did not. Sooner or later it would have broken him. And it probably would have been sooner. Why is that? Francine hesitated. They're going to do an autopsy on Alex, aren't they? The question took Erika by surprise. Yes, that's always done for a suicide. Why do you ask? Because then I know that what I'm about to tell you will come out anyway. My conscience feels lighter, at least. She stubbed out the cigarette carefully. You must know that Alex has been going to Fjällbacka much more often for the past 6 months or so. Yes, Erika said. The grapevine works very well in small towns. According to the local gossip, she was in Fjällbacka more or less every weekend, alone. Alone is not exactly the whole truth. Francine hesitated again. She had met someone there. A man. Well, it wasn't the first time that Alex had had an affair, but somehow I got the feeling that this was different. For the first time in all the years we've known each other, she seemed almost content. And I know that she couldn't have taken her own life. Someone must have murdered her, I have no doubt about that. How can you be so sure? Francine looked at her. Because she was pregnant. Alex Dragia and Stuart McLaughlin were reading The Ice Princess by Camilla Lackberg. The translator was Stephen T. Murray. The Ice Princess was abridged for radio by Alison Joseph and produced by Gemma Jenkins.